Good evening and welcome. Tonight on the program, we catch up with Reverend Bob Mathias. Then we take a look at his Chalice collection and some interesting stories. And finally, we sit down with Nancy Rice and talk about our adult education programs. All this tonight on the Chronicle. First up, we have a chance to sit down with the Reverend Bob Mathias, a good friend here to everyone at Covenant. If you don't know him, you will. Let's check in. Welcome back to the program. I'm here with the Reverend Bob Mathias. Bob, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here, Brian. Thanks for having me.
So, you're not a member of Covenant, but you do worship with us, and your wife is a member.
That's correct.
And you're actually a retired pastor yourself. Where are you originally from?
I'm originally from Long Island, New York. This is where I grew up, just outside of New York City, about 20 minutes.
Excellent, okay. What made you decide to go to seminary?
Well, Brian, that's a long story. Both my father and my grandfather were Presbyterian pastors. And as a child of a pastor in a pastor's home, you fight the call that God is trying to give to you for a long time. I made it all the way to my freshman year of college, where I was going to major in political science, because I thought that was one of the ways to change the world. But in 1963, I went to the March on Washington at the Lincoln Memorial, listened to the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King, and was tremendously moved by the words that he had to say. Heard the call of the Lord again and said, this is the way to change the world, was through the church and through my faith in Jesus Christ. And so I switched from political science to religion. I went home and told Mom and Dad that I was going to be a pastor, and they were delighted, and also reminded me that they knew it all the time. So that's how it happened.
Excellent. Very good, good. How many churches have you been a part of?
I served as pastor of the same two churches for 41 years here in the Beaver Butler Presbytery. I was at the Concord Presbyterian Church, which is a little town in Booker, PA, up on Route 38, and just 4 miles further up the road in North Washington.
Is there any memory from that time that stands out more than another?
Well, Brian, there are three, but we don't have time on this show to share all of them. Let me just tell you one, since today we are talking about chalices.
Yes, we will be.
This goes way back to one of the earlier communion services that I had as a young pastor in the Concord Church. And as we were preparing in the pastor's study for the serving of the communion, we had 9 elders in those days. That's what it took to distribute the elements, and we took them to the pews in those days. And as we were doing this, they cautioned me that there was a gentleman in the last pew who suffered from a disease that caused him to shake. I'm sure it was Parkinson's, but it was never mentioned. And that we had to be careful, whoever took him the communion cup and allowed him to take it out of the tray, had to be very careful that he wouldn't spill it on himself, and so on and so forth. And I said, okay, well, you keep an eye on that, and we'll make sure that we don't have any problems, and if you need to hold it and put it up to his lips, you can do that. And came time for the service, and the elders came forward, and they took their trays, they went back down the side aisles, the center aisles, and I kept my eye on what was happening in the back. I got back to the gentleman. He just simply reached into the tray, took the cup out of the tray, and held it in his hands till it was time for all of us to partake together. And I saw that as a miracle of the power of the service of communion and our faith in God. And the whole session was truly moved by that, because we had made such a point of the fact that he would not be able to stay still.
It's a wonderful story.
Touched us all.
That is something you would remember, yes, after all those years, yes. Your wife, Ione, is very well known to us. How did you meet her?
Well, when I came to the Concord Presbyterian Church as pastor, she was a soon-to-be member of the congregation. Ione was in my first confirmation class as our lives continued to evolve, and my first marriage dissolved amicably for different reasons. And Ione returned home. I had married her performed the marriage ceremony for her first marriage. She was in the same situation. We started to date. We fell in love. We got married, kind of a romantic story with a little difference in our ages, and talked a little bit more about that with some of the Chalices because they are a part of that relationship.
So we will stay tuned for the rest of that story. Okay, very good. How did you both end up here at Covenant?
Well, you know, Brian, as a Presbyterian pastor, we don't join a Presbyterian church, or any church really, after we are retired. And I was honorably retired back in 2010. And so I wanted to get around to the Presbyterian churches and meet some of my colleagues in ministry. I hadn't had a chance to hear them preach or see them in action. I was stated clerk of the presbytery for many years, and of course knew of what was happening in most of our churches and keeping track of things from the stated clerk and legal matters point of view, but not the worshiping congregation. So this gave us a chance to get around. We visited about half of them, most of them in the Butler area just because of traveling distance to Beaver. And after some decisions that had to be made when it was getting close to Christmas in the first year that I was retired, and I retired in January, so that gave us nearly a year to do the visiting. Ione said, I want to have a church by the beginning of Advent, and I think we're going to go to Covenant. She liked the music here, she liked the pastor here, she liked the ministry here especially, she liked the whole outreach mission, and so that's why we chose Covenant, and so we've been active here ever since.
That's excellent. What would you tell someone who was thinking about coming to Covenant?
They have a wonderful opportunity to come here and worship God in a way that's relatively unique, has a liturgical bent that I have always enjoyed. The music is excellent. The preaching has always been good. I think we have an excellent preacher right now. People who haven't had a chance to hear Pastor John preach are missing an opportunity. I know you can listen to him on our YouTube channel, but I think it would be wonderful if you could get to the church and hear him preach. He relates well to all of us, even though we are a small congregation. And we are a small congregation, but we are a very active congregation. And I think there's a place for everyone here who's interested in continuing to serve, no matter their age.
Speaking about active, leads right into the next question. What else do you do here besides come and sit on Sundays? How do you get involved?
Well, as you know, Ione's on the session right now, has been for, this is our second go-round, so we put 6 years in. I've been pretty much working with the Department of Maintenance and renovation here. That there are several of us who are younger members of the congregation right now who enjoy the work. I don't know if you can, if your camera's going wide enough, but these railings here that lead up to the north, or to the chancel itself. Yeah, we had those made, and I finished them up, and we got them hung here. We've refloored, we've retiled floors in the hallways and in the bathrooms. We've painted, we've done a lot of work. We're keeping track of some outside projects that need to be done, and that's something that I've had some experience with in the past. I was during the time I was pastor at the Concord Church, we built a new manse, and they pretty much let me take over and handle that general contracting project for about 6 months while I continued my ministry to them, but also serving in that way. So I picked up some extra skills along the way, and that helped. We'll talk about that when we talk about Chalices and some of the mission trips that we took to perform. Kind of.
Very interesting. Okay. Let's switch gears just a little bit.
Sure.
What's been your greatest joy in retirement from ministry?
Well, I think again it falls into that same thing. When I retired, when you're a pastor, I lived in a church-owned manse that we built while I was pastor. So I had to find a house, and that was the first thing. And we were able to find a house, and we intentionally tried to find one that was about half finished. So that gave me an opportunity to completely renovate the lower level, make the basement the way I wanted. So we created something that was very much our own, in addition to what was livable on the first floor. Right. And so that brought a lot of joy to my life. But of course, the greatest joy is always when the first grandchild comes, and they were living in North Carolina at the time, and we got a call to get down here as quickly as you can. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, so we jumped in the truck and started driving to North Carolina. Got there in time for the birth of our first grandchild. child, who is now 4, and we've had another one who is 2. So looking forward, hopefully, to a little bit of traveling back down to now Atlanta, Georgia, rather than North Carolina. So a little further, but still the same joy is there when you see their faces.
Excellent. So traveling brings us to our next question, which is the world. If you had a platform to give the world some words of wisdom today, what would you say to the world?
The same thing Jesus Christ said to his disciples a long time ago. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Treat others as you'd like to be treated.
Good words. And that's our next to the last question, because the last question is words. Bob, give me 3 words that best describe you.
Well, I like to think that I am tolerant. I like to think that I'm caring. And I like to think that I'm happy.
We'll be back in just a little bit, and we'll talk about these chalices we have mentioned here on the program right after this.
On a previous episode of the Chronicle, we mentioned that in the sanctuary there are 3 pieces of furniture in a Presbyterian church, that being the pulpit, the baptismal font, and the communion table. And on that communion table there are 2 items normally there, the bread plate and the chalice for the wine, or in our case the juice. Well, Bob Mathias, who we just talked to, has quite the collection of chalices and some interesting stories. So we thought we'd continue a conversation with him and check those out.
Thank you, Brian. We're here at the communion table in the Covenant Presbyterian Church. As you remember, back on in the first Sunday in October, when we celebrated World Communion Sunday, I had brought several communion chalices from my collection to put on the communion table as a reminder to the folks who would gather in the sanctuary and on our YouTube program of the various communities around the world and around this country where chalices like these were being used. And so over the years I've had an opportunity to collect these chalices, and each one of them has a different special meaning, was used in a different place, in a different setting. I want to share a few of those with you today. The first one is where it all began for me. My dad was a Presbyterian pastor out on Long Island, New York, and whenever missionaries would come home from overseas, they would stop in at 475 Riverside Drive, and then they would go out into the local areas and share about the work that they were doing. This one came from some missionaries from Japan who came to the Presbyterian Church to share with us about what was going on over there. They had some wonderful things that caught the eye of a young child like myself, and one of them was a great big fish flag that they flew outside the front of the church, and there were all kinds of other interesting artifacts. But my eye was captured by this beautiful colored little cup, which it was explained to me was probably used not for communion, but maybe more for tea or for sake. But to me, it was a communion cup. It looked like the communion cup on the table in the church, and they gifted me with this wonderful little cup. And that sort of piqued my interest in cups and chalices and so forth. I had an opportunity over the years to meet with many other missionaries as they came to share with the church and oftentimes stay in the pastor's home, and so I would talk with them about it. And this one came from some missionaries who had been working in India. This is an onyx carved stone chalice that they had used and that they had brought back with them. And when they heard about the fact that I was interested in chalices, my collection was not anywhere as it is today, but they wanted to help me along, and so they left this one for me. And so I remember those folks, and I always think about the people in India who are sharing with us when we celebrate communion. This one, which is inscribed with the name Nicaragua, gives us a pretty good clue as to where it came from. Nicaragua became a very important part of the mission work that we did here through the Beaver Butler Presbytery and through the churches that I served, and with several other ministers too from this presbytery. When the Habitat for Humanity group was formed here in the Butler County area, we had an opportunity to choose an international partner from a list of countries that Habitat was working in at the time. And so we chose the group in Nicaragua. And in doing that, then we said, okay, what we need to do now is organize an opportunity for folks from this area to go to Nicaragua and work with our partners in Habitat for Humanity there. So we made the arrangements, and we had an opportunity to travel together to Nicaragua. We left from the Saxonburg Memorial Church in a van and drove to Georgia. Then we went on down to Florida and flew from Florida to Nicaragua. We arrived in Managua, where we were introduced to the Ministry of Habitat for Humanity and several other groups that were working together in cooperation to help to restore Nicaragua. Nicaragua had gone through a war and a revolution, and the Sandinistas had been in control for a while, but they had now lost their power, and some other things were going on in the government. And basically what had happened was when all of the foreign governments went home, they left the people without medical service, without education, and so forth. So it was a very, very poor country. Most of the roads were already broken and torn up. And we made our way by truck and by boat down the River Rama, kind of a ferry boat. We went all the way down to Bluefields, which was on the eastern coast of Nicaragua. And there we worked on rebuilding some homes that had been destroyed by another hurricane, not the one that that was involved in the life when Roberto Clemente lost his life, but another hurricane that struck in the same general area. So we were rebuilding those homes. And every time we did that, when we would gather together at the end of the day, and certainly at the end of our mission, we would invite all of the folks who were either beneficiaries of the work that we were doing or somehow participated in its planning. We asked them to come and to share with us, and we had a communion service. I asked if anybody had a cup that we might use for the communion service, and this wooden cup was presented to me. Probably came from a local gift shop where you could buy souvenirs and so forth, but it has a lot more meaning to me now since we shared it together with those folks by the sea in Bluefields, Nicaragua. This is another chalice, which is a favorite of mine. As you can see, it's made of several different types of hardwood. I was traveling north through the Pennsylvania country up to Bradford, and I stopped at a little woodworking shop just outside of Kane, Pennsylvania, and I saw this wooden chalice there, and I talked to the man who created it. I'll give him a little credit. His name is Dean Ackley, and I talked a little bit about it and told him about my collection that I had of chalices, and he insisted that I take this one if I would share it with others and do what we've been doing, not only here today, but with various times when communion was being celebrated. He had no idea that when he made that cup that was what it was going to be, but he was delighted to give me that, and so I thank Dean for that one. Brass has always been a favorite for chalices of one kind or another. And so when I saw this one while I was traveling through Santiago de Compostela in Spain, in a window, not in the cathedral there, which is the end of the trail for those who are making the trip across Europe, the proprietor told me a little bit of the history of this brass, and I'm not sure I believed everything that he told me about it. He said it was made from melted down brass shells, but that were used for cannonry. But I was delighted to be able to get that because it's a very difficult place to find a chalice, even though I've been there many times and have looked in various stores and souvenir shops and talked with churches and places about it. So I was glad to get that brass chalice from there. The Concord Church was lucky enough to have a woman who chose to go into the ministry, and she became a commissioned lay pastor and went out to serve several different congregations in the Midwest, especially to our Native American brothers and sisters out there. She sent me this cup from their church as one that they had used for communion, because she also knew about my chalices. So Audrey, wherever you are today, we're thinking about you and thank you for that gift. It also came with a tray to hold the loaf of bread, so we appreciated that. This piece of pottery, which looks not like a chalice to most of us, was a very important part of a communion service that we held one day in Nicaragua while we were there. I mentioned the trip to Nicaragua earlier. We made several trips again. The thing I liked the most about this was that when this pitcher was filled, it was filled with guava juice. It was not filled with the wine or the grape juice that we were used to in our own communion services here, but the fruit of the vine, which was available to us there. And we were in a tiny little village called Tierra, Colorado. We had been there a year previous and helped to build a church. When we left, it was not quite finished yet. It was a beautiful church, had a stained glass window in it. We made all the bricks and mixed the mortar right there on site. So the next year when we returned to Nicaragua with another group of folks, many of them who had been there before, everyone said, can't we go back to Tierra, Colorado and see that church? We think it's finished. And so on a Sabbath morning, on a Sunday morning in Nicaragua, we all loaded into an old truck and we headed up the dirt roads that were going to take us back to Tierra, Colorado. We arrived there at about 11 o'clock, and we could hear the congregation in the church singing. And they were singing, "They'll Know We Are Christians by Our Love." We got out of the truck, and we quietly walked through the back doors and spread across the back of the church. And when the priest, who, by the way, was a woman, saw us in the back, she said, "Bon dia, our friends from the United States are here." And everybody turned around and they clapped and they sang and they came back and they hugged and they kissed us. And we had an opportunity to worship and to share the sacrament with this pitcher filled with guava, a very unusual thing in a Catholic church, but the Protestants and the Catholics got along very, very well. And it was just a truly amazing experience to be there with them. And this will always hold a special place in my heart. The General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, as they were meeting annually until recently, would always have in some large hall, whether it was a stadium or a basketball or a hockey arena, in the city where we were meeting, would always ask for local artisans to craft for them something that they could use as a communion vessel. Because when 16,000 people, mostly Presbyterians, but others in the community were invited to come and share the Lord's Supper with us, there was a tremendous amount of work that needed to be done to plan to get the elements to everybody. I have two here that represent a couple of the times that I was to General Assembly. I was a commissioner twice, and I also went as stated clerk to many of them. But after the service was over, the communion ware that had been created was available for sale to as long as they had some. This one came from the General Assembly that was held in Louisville. Again, it's some local pottery, a little bit more professionally looking maybe, perhaps. But this was the one that always intrigued me. I don't know if you can see this on your camera there, Brian, but there is a Presbyterian. Our Presbyterian symbol is here on the front of this. To think in terms of a bowl as the chalice by which we could share the communion service. Because with 16,000 people, back in those days before the virus that we have now and so forth, you passed a common cup. And this gave you an opportunity for dipping your bread in tinction into the bowl and then passing it on to the neighbors all around. So 16,000 people passing these communion chalices around the large arena. This one I believe was from Charlotte, North Carolina, and this one I think I mentioned earlier was from Louisville. Here's another one that came to me from one of the experiences that we had on a Native American reservation in a town called Sacaton. We were visiting that area as we were working and doing a project at the Cook Christian Training School, which used to be a Presbyterian-related educational institution. And while we were there, we had an opportunity to go out on a Wednesday evening fellowship, which then turned into an agape meal, which then turned into communion, which then turned into a little worship service in which we used a cup like this to celebrate the Lord's Supper. The interesting thing that happened to me personally on that particular trip was to be sitting in a seat in the fellowship hall and reaching under the pew in front of me to get a hymn book. and I opened up the hymn book to the page of the song we were supposed to sing, and then I began looking in the front of the hymn book, and when I opened it up and looked at it, it said, donated by the First Presbyterian Church of Northumberland, Pennsylvania. And I looked at it again, and I said, given in honor of the Reverend Perry T. Brocious. Perry T. Brocious was my grandfather. And to see a hymnal from his congregation with his name in it at a mission station where we had been celebrating together the sacrament of the Lord's Supper just moved me to tears, and I had to share that with the congregation, and it was very, very interesting experience to know that. Now this one is probably one of the more interesting, certainly it's one of the more colorful of the chalices that I have in my collection. And I can remember when we were looking for a chalice to use for a communion service on our first mission trip to New Orleans following the Hurricane Katrina. We were gathered together in a Methodist fellowship hall, and I said, do you think the Methodists have a chalice somewhere around that we could use, because it was time for us to have that service. And somebody was able to go digging around, more than likely in the fellowship hall, perhaps with their other stemware. They found this, but we turned it into the communion chalice for that service for the first time with the group that went down there. We returned several times to the area of Slidell and worked on those homes. And each time we did, we would gather together and have a communion service. At a community center in Slidell, we used this particular cup to use for our chalice. So that reminds me of that wonderful group of folks who went back, and some of the young people from the Mount Chestnut Presbyterian Church helped to finish that community center, put a new roof on. It was 110 degrees, and it was an amazing, amazing piece of work that we were able to accomplish under those difficult circumstances. Another stone one, there are several that have been carved out of stone up here. This one comes from Pakistan. And again, that was one of the gifts from Pakistani missionaries who had returned home for a while and came and visited the churches where I was pastor. When I talked to them and they saw my collection, they said, oh, I think we have something here that we'd like to add to that collection. So there it is. I was just sharing with Brian, I just was reading just the other day that the Pakistani Christian church just in 2018 ended a year of Eucharistic ministry, and they added 50,000 folks taking their first communion service. Not sure whether they used a cup just like that or not, but it was nice to hear that the Christian church in a Muslim country like Pakistan was making some inroads and adding some folks to their list of people. Again, another one that caught my eye, and this is one that we had an opportunity to use. I always stuck a chalice or two in my suitcase whenever we were traveling. So this one we had an opportunity to use when we were at a place out in Albuquerque, New Mexico, called Wasatch Academy. And that was Wasatch Academy was in Utah. We were at the Menaul School. When we used this particular Southwest design on here, I guess, to share for the communion service. So I think about that group of people who went on that trip, and we're reminded of that. This last one that I want to share, again, very, very significant to me. It is a chalice that is carved from a piece of olive wood that on my first trip to the Holy Land in 1978, with a group from the College of Worcester, which is where I did my undergraduate work, meeting with our New Testament professor, J. Arthur Baird, we had an opportunity to visit many, many of the holy sites, as well as get involved in some of the politics that was going on. This wasn't too far after the 1967 war that lasted for 7 days in Israel. But we had an opportunity to spread out one day, and so I traveled to Bethlehem with 2 or 3 others. Bethlehem did not have a large wall blocking its entranceway back in those days as it does today, making it more difficult for anybody to get into the area. And of course the problems in the Middle East always make it difficult to travel there. But I was looking specifically for an olive wood manger scene, the creche and the camels and so on and so forth. And while I was there, dickering and bargaining with the folks who made those pieces, I saw this and I said, I'd like to have that. And he said, well, if you buy this particular set, then I will include this, which is how we did things in those days. I had a price, they had a price, and we bickered back and forth for a while. And finally, I ended up with this olive wood communion chalice. And it was a good thing I did, because when I got back to the rest of the group in Jerusalem and we continued our travels, we went north, up past the Sea of Galilee, up towards Magdala, to a place called Nafkin-Asar, which was a kibbutz that had been very, very active in defending the northern part of the country, especially during the war with Syria and during that 1987 war. So we broke this out by the Sea of Galilee, there in the kibbutz, shared communion with anybody who wanted to share. So that brought this around full circle, from Bethlehem to the Sea of Galilee. And with that, I'm happy to say thank you very much for sharing with me today. God bless you all. May you come to the table of our Lord Jesus Christ in remembrance of him.
Thanks, Bob. Some great stories. We'll be back in just a moment. Our final segment tonight takes a look at Christian education, and here at Covenant, that means adult education, Sunday school and otherwise. And for that, let's check in with Ms. Nancy Rice.
Nancy Rice here to talk to you about Christian education opportunities here at Covenant Church. Our Christian education centers around what we like best, which is discussing and also learning. And we have two opportunities for people to come and enjoy Christian education here at Covenant right now: Seekers and People for Peace. And I'll talk to you a little bit about both of them. First of all, Seekers meets at 9:45 on Sunday mornings, and we have done in the past Pneuma with Rob Bell, which is a discussion based on a short video about what it's like being a Christian in the world today. And also we have done in the past a Great Courses series on the book of Genesis, which was based on a video presentation by Dr. Gary Rensburg, a professor at Rutgers University. We learned a lot about Genesis from the videos and our discussion and Bible reading on that. At present, we are doing a series, we're in the midst of a series called What's So Amazing About Grace by Philip Yancey. And we are learning and discussing much about forgiveness and God's grace right now. It's a video for about 10-12 minutes, and then some Bible reading and some discussion based on the video. And soon it will be Advent season, so beginning on November 29th, we are going to take time off from What's So Amazing About Grace and do a special Advent study called Let Us Go Now to Bethlehem. And that will take us through the Advent season, and then we will finish our Philip Yancey study and go on to something new that we will choose at a later date. Now, People for Peace meets at 11 o'clock on the second and fourth Tuesday of the month. We bring our lunch and we just eat there. The study that we're doing now is called Great Peacemakers, True Stories from Around the World. And we discuss people such as Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, the Dalai Lama, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and so forth. We have just a few sections to go on that. So our next class will be on November 12th at 11 a.m. And the fourth Thursday this month is a little thing called Thanksgiving, so we will not be meeting. In December, we will meet on December 10th at 11 o'clock, and the fourth Sunday in December is a little thing called Christmas Eve, so we will not meet that day. We will resume again the second Thursday in January with a new study, which we will be choosing soon. Besides the study and discussion, we also try to be of service to people in the community. So right now, every time we meet, we take a small collection for our next door neighbor, Meals on Wheels. And we have also helped out with getting clothes for children going into foster care, providing sheets and towels for Catholic Charities, who gives them to people who are there setting up in an apartment who really just need everything. We've also brought paper products and so forth for the Voice outreach just across the street. And this week we are helping out our church by hosting a fellowship hour, and we are also putting some flowers on the altar in memory of some previous members who have passed on. So I would like you to join us anytime for these two opportunities in Christian education. All are welcome, and I hope you will stop by and see us soon.
Nancy, thank you for that information. That'll about do it for this episode of the Chronicle. We'll see you again for the next issue in December. Remember, every day is a blessed day. Have a great evening, everyone.